Okay, thank you, Margaret, for that introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to respond to Warhol in a way that Cary will talk more about as well. But I just wanted to go through a little bit of the Andy Warhol Legacy Project, what it led me to, where it made me think what I thought about to do the importance of being photographed. So this is just a few images. Carolina Herrera. So if you know anything about Warhol, you know that he's incredibly important. In fact, there might not be any more influential artist in the 20th century. And in order to finance a lot of the projects that he did in his later life, he created this robust portraiture business. And the portraits often began with Polaroids. You would go to his studio, you would have lunch, you would have your photograph taken, and then many months later, many years later, a painted portrait would appear. They were commissioned portraits. I think it cost, what, $30,000 to get a portrait done. And what they became is the people who had their photographs taken became the who's who of the art world and also of popular culture. This is Dorothy Lichtenstein. Before we just saw Dorothy Hamill. This is Carlo Di Bonetti, and who was the head of one of the heads of Fiat in the 1970s. And I was looking through these photographs with Peter Foe, our curator of the collection, is that some people are really want to be photographed, and some people are really ready for the gaze of the camera, and there are other people who are totally not. In this case, you can see Benedetti is really ready to have his photograph taken, some with makeup, some without. The makeup for these things is also really, really important. This is Marella Agnelli, who was also, this photograph actually did become a painting. And that if they told you who was who, they became sort of a marker of what was celebrity, what was beautiful, what was fashionable, what was stylish, what was attractive, what was important. And that's really what led me to this is Pia Miller, who was the heiress to the duty-free fortune. And she has the bright red lipstick and the pancake makeup. This is Torsten Leah, who's somebody who's not ready to be photographed. This is a photograph of Truman Capote and John Gould, who was the head of Paramount Pictures. You see where I was going. This is an unidentified woman from the 1980s. So this exhibition that I curated, The Importance of Being Photographed, is in part two streams of influence. It's the Andy Warhol photographs and the Polaroids, which were about celebrity and other things like that. And it's also in part about Oscar Wilde, who wrote in 1895 a play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And it's sort of two plot lines where two men are going after these women, and it's unclear if they really have the social stature to be able to marry these women. It's a very funny play. And it premiered right before Oscar Wilde was imprisoned for indecency, which we all, I assume, know something about. So then this exhibition became about not only the rapport that a photographer can have with his or her subject, but also all these other issues, whether they're celebrity, whether they're youth and beauty, whether they're attractiveness or sexuality, but all these things play into the photographs that I chose for the exhibition. So this is a work by Tina Barney. It's called Family Commission, The Waterfalls from 2007. And Tina Barney does much the same thing that Warhol did. She was given a camera at the age of 30, and she decided to photograph what she knows. She's from the Upper East Side of New York. She comes from a very wealthy family. She summers in the Hamptons like many other people, many other wealthy people. And so she photographs those people, and she's asked by them to make these photographs. And she asks very little else of them. They can choose the place, but by and large, she's the one who captures the moment where it's either very strange among the family members or it's very loving among the family members. And you can see both of that in this photograph here. This is another earlier photograph from 1997 of Marina and Peter, and Peter is obviously the father, Marina is the daughter, and I don't think Peter is very pleased that his daughter is smoking in front of him. This is another one from very recently of Michael Stipe. So again, celebrity is a big deal to Tina Barney as it was to Warhol. This is a photograph by a young Chicago photographer named Jason Lazarus, who often photographs very, very quirky things. In this case, the subject is not really ready to be photographed, but he has an enormous amount of celebrity because he was the baby on the cover of the Nirvana Nevermind album. So I'm sure you all remember it. In 1997, there was this gorgeous cover of a record that went platinum many, many times, and there was a baby on the cover. Well, this baby is now graduating from high school in this photograph, and Jason Lazarus found him through the internet and photographed him. And now, even though Spencer Eldon, the boy in the photograph, didn't choose his celebrity, it's become a pervasive thing via Google, via the internet. We know who Spencer Eldon is, even if he's not quite ready for us to know who he is. This is another California-based photographer, Mallory Martyr, who is also influenced by film much the same way that Warhol was. And she chooses very cinematic places to take photographs of people that she actually knows well, to probe intimacy, to probe how much we can know when the photographer snaps the picture of the subject. This is another photograph by Mallory Martyr, which is two people about to engage in something that's probably very familiar to us, but we rarely have insight into, getting into the bedroom with those actual people. Here's another one. And then Ryan McGinnis photographs his set in New York. He says that he is very influenced by Nan Goldin, another contemporary photographer. And like Warhol, he's very interested in gay and very youth-oriented or beautiful movements. This is Yellow Marcel from 2007, I believe. This is another photograph called Ryan. And this is Luz. Luz, to me, looks like a Benetton advertisement, and I can see Warhol being intrigued the same way Ryan McGinnis was with her. He started off photographing his friends while they were partying and other things like that, and then decided that he needed to have the control of the studio portrait to really get the kind of insight that he was looking for. This is Catherine Opie. Catherine Opie rose to prominence photographing people on the margins of society, people in the queer community and other things like that, even photographing herself very often. And lately she's decided that her work has really become about building communities and what constitutes a community and how we might form communities. And she grew up in Ohio, and she's decided that she wants to photograph high school football players because of the communities that they form, and also because they function as celebrities in their own worlds. Here's another one. This is Leon from very recently. Leon, to me, is not ready to be photographed, but his picture works nonetheless. And this is Connor. Alex Soth is somebody, I think, who challenges Warhol on many levels, and he has spent years photographing people also on the margins of society, but also in very strange places in the United States. He did, for example, a series all along the Mississippi, and he called it Sleeping by the Mississippi. So he started in Minnesota and made his way down to Louisiana. This is Odessa in Joelton, Tennessee, and she was actually the wife of an Iraqi war veteran. This was taken in 2004. And he takes his photographs with 4x5 cameras, and they take a lot of time to set up, almost 2 hours. And so in the time that it takes for him to set up the photograph and the time it takes for the subject to sit there, they take on a more introverted stance in their way. And the photographs then have more insight than they might normally have because they take so long to take. This is a photograph from the series by the Mississippi, and this is Lenny in his kitchen from 2004. And then this is a recent work by Dawood Bay, where he traveled to Georgia and put two people together that wouldn't have anything to do with each other and asked them to tell their stories. So the man on your right is actually the first African-American archivist, even though he's not African-American. He chose to work on African-American subjects because he found that they were very, very interesting. And the other man sitting next to him is a gay student, African-American student who attends Emory University, I believe. And they both, sometimes the works are shown with a label explaining how these two men came to be photographed together. This is another recent photograph. And then Katy Grin placed ads in small newspapers like the Poughkeepsie State Journal and asked people if they would call her to be photographed, and sure enough, people didn't call her. She never picked up the phone when they called. She would wait, let them leave a message, and then call them back. And the people, the subjects that she was photographing, chose where they wanted to be and what they wanted to wear, and if they wanted to take their clothes off, which inevitably they did. So just as Warhol was sort of hinting at sexuality, this is another instance where people are attaining a kind of celebrity and also choosing to present their own kind of sexuality. So now I'm going to lead you over to Cary. We're going to go to the internet.
Yeah. Well, besides Margaret giving me an incredibly generous introduction, when Jane called to say that Margaret suggested that I come and do this talk, I was a bit put back. I was like, oh, I don't think of myself as a Warhol authority in the sense of doing talks, but I just can't say no to things, so I accepted. And the more I thought about how to present or how to talk about his work, the more I kept on coming up with different ideas and different options. And in the end, I threw away all the ideas and tried to welcome all the images instead of ideas. And of course, I thought, well, the best thing to do was to go to Google, because there's like 48,000 images that pop up if you type in Andy Warhol. There's just a, oh, how do we I think scroll. I mean, there's just so many different images, and he's one of the few artists that I think can withstand this sort of scrutiny, and also this immediate identification with anybody in the world. I mean, I think there's, for the 20th century, people would say Picasso's the first half and Warhol's the second half. I think Warhol's also the beginning of the 21st century in the sense that this is kind of the first generation that is around after his death, when Warhol officially becomes art history as opposed to living art history. To me, Warhol is always a shy and honest artist. I think his works are always edited and scaled down to the most perfect final product. Even his, to me, it's sort of like a bad Woody Allen movie is still better than everyone else's movie. And in the same sense, people have revisited Warhol over and over again to the point where everything that they used to dismiss are now recognized as really quite perfect in their own right also. Last year, the Brooklyn Museum had a show of his 80s works, and the 80s were always dismissed by people. But now we look at that late period, and it's the most conceptual, it's the most challenging as far as relating to his academic period of the 1940s when he was a student and abstract expressionism was the art that people were talking about at the time. The piss paintings, the oxidation paintings, the Rorschach paintings, the shadows. I mean, these were all things that, until recently people didn't think of as subject matter or even something that could be made into art. I mean, this idea of a shadow, and yet it's a final canvas that it's really quite beautiful and a complete art composition. All of these portraits, everything's identifiable, and it's so hard to say what comes first when you think of a Warhol image. Was it the sitter that he was able to, channel and realize that this person was going to be important to us forever, like Marilyn and Jackie, or even his own self-portraits, and for Mao for other reasons, or was this just a coincidence that he actually had this insight? Well, here we go into these, they're along this row, we've got, this top row, which might not have been considered a very successful row for many years. There's the Apple image from the ad series, or the sports figures in the middle. And I think I could bet my life on the next flower one not being Warhol, but being a bad inspiration. I mean, I think one of the funny things is he was able to make incredibly iconic images out of Marilyn and Jackie and people of his own generation, and perhaps the Mona Lisa is a failed venture where he tries to revisit art history, and he's really much more of a person of his own time. The grid next to the sports figures is a bit difficult to tell from this one. But this was a portrait of the 10 artists that were showing at Leo Castelli Gallery in 1965 at the same time he was. So you've got Lee Bonteque, Frank Stella, Larry Poons, Robert Morris, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, Rosenquist, Lichtenstein, and himself, his self-portrait. Here we've got some real Warhol images and some not real ones. Let's see. And then, to me, the Brillo box is really kind of the one of the great sculptures of the 20th century. At the same time he did the Brillo box, which has really been coined, the sculpture. At the same time, he did about 6 other boxes too. There was Kellogg's Cornflakes and Del Monte Peaches and Heinz tomato juice and a yellow Brillo box, a white Brillo box. There were, here's a late self-portrait. I think he got into self-portraiture a lot in the 80s when he realized that clients really liked these self-portraits. He tried to sometimes juicy them up a bit. There are some where he's holding a skull. Tried to make himself a little more prophetic. There's one famous one where it's called The Shadow. So instead of self-portrait, it's The Shadow. But in the end, I think Warhol was always challenging the art world as a conceptual artist more than the sort of cultural whisperer that he was dismissed as. I think, for years I always felt a little guilty when people would say, "Oh, who's your favorite artist?" And I'd always want to say, Andy Warhol is my first answer, because I felt, oh, that doesn't, people immediately dismissed the rest of my answer. That this idea that, oh, like, this is what you read, this is what you look at, but in the end, I think there will be John Richardsons who will be writing about him this century that will bring him to a completely serious level. I think this Google idea is a new idea for me, and I tell it's going a little slow, so I'm totally open to questions.
I have a question to start. So Warhol is known first and foremost as a pop artist, but of course the divide between high and low art has changed quite a bit. Do you think that he foreshadowed that? He in part started this evolution for us?
Well, I think the high and low is a tricky thing, because I think in a way he was very high culture as far as what art is about and his respect for art. So I don't know although he was all embracing and really open to new ideas, I think he had a really healthy attitude about that. I'm curious about what he would think about what the low is right now. I think the low right now seems to me, at least, as a cranky old man, to be about something different than what he was looking at. I think what he was looking at, he didn't think of as low culture or as even something that was ephemeral. I think he took it all very seriously, and he tried to also keep it a part of the art that came before. I don't think he was, in a way, trying to break away as much as to add on to.
And of course, his famous quote, "Everyone will be famous for 15 minutes," now really has become true because of Facebook and YouTube and other things like that. Do you think that was in part his intention, that he wanted a sort of populist movement towards celebrity, or was he?
Well, I think in one way he's very shy, and he liked all these things a step back from where it was going on. I'm not sure he would be looking at YouTube all day long. I think he might take clips of YouTube and intellectualize it, but I don't know if he would be that open that everything is now up for grabs as being art. I think he really is an incredible genius, and if he was able to do that, I'm sure I have all the confidence that he would be doing it in the right way and open our eyes to all of these things that are going on right now. Because personally, I don't feel like there's any artist that has really done something with it in a profound way. Maybe he would have, or maybe he would have retreated. I mean, when he made films, he didn't make trashy beach blanket films. He made high art films. And when he made paintings, he didn't make violent paintings that attacked the canvas or the picture plane. He made, paintings that were kind of pure. So I think there's definitely an unknown factor about what's going on today. I mean, in a way, people use his foundation as a trampoline for better or worse. But sometimes I get really bored with the art world, and I would love to feel like there's somebody who totally reopens my eyes and changes this perception around about what is available to us and how to make it into this next body of work that describes what we're living.
That makes perfect sense. Do you want to talk about your own work? Okay. And what about Warhol's change? What about this divide between what he made for a commission, I mean, essentially, which was a working studio, much the same way, people had portraiture studios in the 17th century. He did this in the 1980s. I mean, Tina Barney does it now. Yeah. What about this kind of commercialism that was then funding other projects?
Well, I love it. I mean, he definitely kept the Warhol factory going, and for works that were kind of dismissed for a long time as just giving rich people what they wanted. I mean, it really is great to now go into a museum show and see this body of work. It really did capture this time period, and it really it makes everyone special. I think once in a while for work, I'll get a call from someone I don't know, and they'll be on the phone, and they say, well, my mother had her portrait done by Warhol, and suddenly, in my mind, this mother becomes this amazing person, and I'll ask questions, and like, oh, did your mother know Warhol? No, and do you have other art? Was she an art collector? No. It was just like, somebody takes a trip from, Alabama, and they go to Warhol studio, and they had their portrait done, and it was just like, oh, it was like part of my shopping list when I went to New York. But, and so, at the time it might have seemed kind of frivolous, but it really is so evocative of such a special situation.
And what about the editing process that you mentioned before? Because, I mean, he did take everything in series, and you'll notice when you go to look at the Polaroids, there are lots of Polaroids, 5, 6, 7 of the same person over and over again, different exposures, but the same person, sometimes with the same makeup, sometimes with different makeup. And you mentioned before that the editing is always perfect with Warhols.
Well, for years people would also dismiss him as saying, oh, his studio people would do the compositions. And yes, a lot of the times I think that was his way of letting chance happen, where he'd say, oh, you play with this color, or, this, for lack of a better word, this faux cubist squares that he did in a lot of portraiture for the final paintings. But I think he tweaked and he did things. It's the same story with like the Ethel Skull portrait, where he sent over the multiple canvases and he told them to just put it on the wall in any order, and then he came over and he tweaked a couple of things. But yeah, I think any artist of the 20th century knows that there's chance involved. I mean, it was something that was, that door was opened by ARP and by the suprematists, and there were different things but I think Warhol's ego was so much in check that he could do this delegation without tyranny and without saying he has to make his own mark. And I think he knew that the final result somehow would work out.
So in a way, I did the importance of being photographed thinking that in a way we all work under the shadow of Warhol. We're all responding to him, either challenging him the way Alex Soth does or repeating in essence what he did the way Tina Barney did. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think it's tricky. I think there's people of my generation and younger that make art. We do like to, we do look at things and we do look for little openings that we can walk through and say, well, there's a precedent here, or there's an excuse here, or we're making a secret reference here. I don't know any of those artists personally to know that that's their mindset. I have to say that a lot of people I know that I think are using Warhol with that platform are in somewhat denial of it, more so than embracing or recognizing it. I think, there's this new show opening at the Met, and the list of artists is, it's a bit snoozy. I think, it's about 100 artists that are in almost every show, but they found a very didactic image that will somehow connect to a Warhol image. So Ai Weiwei has this, ancient urn that has Coca-Cola painted on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is what it is. But I don't really think of Ai Weiwei, is so much working in a Warhol vein. Christopher Wool, obviously there's a screen print factor and a flat picture plane, and I think with any special artist, they really, in the end, are their own. Picasso is his own person, Warhol is his own person, Richard Archwager is his own person, Peter Saul is his own person. Certain generations take longer to connect with certain artists. I mean, we were talking about Peter Saul, and it took a couple of additional generations to get used to these very rough images. So the same thing with like John Wesley, who was always a part of the pop art movement, mm-hmm. But once again, it took a few new generations to look at this with fresh eyes, as opposed to saying, oh, the original generation that might say, oh, you missed the mark of what the overall essence of what we're looking for at the time. So I don't know about which artists are closest to him in vein these days. I mean, sometimes I as a channeling factor, you go in and there's some artists that I think are much more embracing of Warhol, like Rob Pruitt, who also is very conceptual in a lot of ways, but he also has done very obvious homages to Warhol, including the chrome sculpture in Union Square Park, where it is a portrait of Warhol with his shopping bags. And there's something very Warholian about the sculpture, but at the same time, it's Rob Pruitt, and I don't think of it at all like Andy Warhol.
Mm-hmm. I think we might be ready for a few questions now.
Oh, well, I love it. It's, why not? I think these things are kind of fun. I mean, I think it's just a Target thing, which, I've rushed to Target for some of their other Liberty products, or Sony too. So I'll have some of these cans in my closet until they burst, I guess.
How big is the gift to the University of South Florida?
It is.
The number of photographs of whatever they are.
It is 156 photographs, 101, I believe, are Polaroids, and the remaining photographs are the silver black and white prints, silver gelatin prints.
Do you plan to show them?
We have to show them every 10 years, I believe, according to the gift, and
Some
Peter,
of us would like to see them sooner.
yeah. They're on display right now. And if we have a few questions, we will see them sooner rather than later, but I encourage you to ask questions nonetheless. Other questions? Wendy?
Either of you could probably address this, but I'm interested in the way that that archive of pictures has been, I guess, disseminated to various institutions. And I wonder what either of you could address this. What does it mean for them to have changed in terms of their context of being sort of archive a material that was drawn upon with other works to then going out into these various institutions as these kinds of bodies of work in their own right?
I think they were all gifted to university museums, and the goal was to engender scholarship about Warhol. This is something Cary and I were discussing earlier. Even though Warhol is incredibly influential, there are only a handful of dissertations about him, in part because the Academy was not really thinking of him as a serious artist. And if you ever want to look, there aren't that many dissertations about Warhol, and there aren't that many books about Warhol. So this was one way that the foundation could engender more scholarship about him. And some institutions show the gift, just the gift as, you know, here are Warhols, aren't they interesting? And inevitably they are, in my opinion. And some people did group exhibitions based on that. For example, New York University did a downtown scene trying to document the 1980s punk scene and other things in New York. We, for example, you know, showed the gift and then showed a show that went along with it. But a lot of people just showed the show, just showed the gift as it is, because the photographs in and of themselves are interesting enough to be looked at.
I think for years, the idea of them just being working studies for paintings, you know, I don't know if Warhol ever, I think once in a while he did sign them individually and give them to people as gifts. And when the authentication board that is recently disbanded, but the estate and the authentication board were releasing them with individual authentication numbers. So I think in their official eyes, they were, complete sets, pieces of art on their own. And,
And another question, this is, I guess, more for you, Jane. One of the things that intrigues me about the exhibition, I haven't seen it yet, I'm excited to see it, is a very different air about the two sets of photographs, the Warhol photographs and then the other curated exhibition. And that is that there's this sense of maybe having arrived somewhat socially, financially, or however, by a person who would be appearing in one of those Warhol photographs. You know, you mentioned it almost as like an item of shopping so there's a sort of privilege about that. There's a real vulnerability in a lot of the photographs that are in the other exhibitions. And so could you just speak a little bit to how you decided to bring those two very different elements together in the exhibition?
Well, it's funny, when we were looking through the photographs today, when Cary and I were going through the exhibition, it strikes me that the Warhol Polaroids are actually also make people seem very, very vulnerable. For example, Pia Miller to me seems actually very, very scared, even though she's the heiress to the duty-free fortune. And it's true that the Warhol gift was just a point of departure for me, and then the photography exhibition took on these other themes, which are celebrity and despair and intimacy and sexuality and the strangeness, albeit always a rapport, but sometimes a strange rapport between the photographer and the sitter. But as I learned more about the Warhols, though, also, he knew some of the people that he photographed very, very well, and he knew others almost not at all. There's a photograph of Truman Capote with John Gould, who happened to be the head of Paramount Pictures, and you get a sense that he knew those men very, very well. There's one unidentified man. But then you know when he was photographing, for example, Morella Agnelli, that he probably did not know her that well, even though her photograph did actually become a portrait. Would you agree with me on that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think, you know, generally he's a very shy person, and when you, if you ever read the Warhol Diaries, which I totally recommend as a good reread, bedside, you know, permanent bedside book, but it's, you know, he's very shy in a lot of situations. I think, you know, the portraits were basically a job. I mean, he was, you know, this was a way of him, as Jane said, earning money and having this sort of factory continue working. But these were very immediate situations. I mean, it was, you know, he had his Polaroid, which was probably very comfortable for him to hold and to work with. But you know, here's a stranger who came in and was expecting you to make them look beautiful and, you know, in every sense of the word. So it probably wasn't, you know, an extremely casual situation.
I'm trying to think of a single example of sort of one of those images that made it to the screen prints. We know a lot that had a sense of vulnerability about them.
Well, I mean, there's the electric chair, which, you know, when you think of him as a devout Catholic, I mean, that's sort of that. I mean, but generally speaking, you know, a lot of his prints that he really formalized, he didn't take the photos himself. So, I mean, there's the Mick Jagger prints. There's 10 different images, and a few of them look a little more sexy, and a few of them look a little more frightened. But, you know, there's 10 different images there. The drag queens don't look very vulnerable at all.
But and the most vulnerable of all are the ones, the photographs that he took of himself.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's the point. Yeah.
Especially in the 80s when he, you know, he was dressing up half as a man, half as a woman, and you know, and then those became the basis for the camouflage portraits much later, which I never knew were commercially successful, although that doesn't surprise me.
No.
Is there another question?
This seems to be the year of Warhol. Is it because he's been dead for 25 years, or he's had 50 years of his work, or what brought all this?
Yeah, you know, I mean, that's a good question, because sometimes I mean, I'm always glad when people get on the bandwagon, but then I also get resentful that it's taken them this long. But I think there is this 25-year scenario, and then I think there's also a certain generation coming into to probably power at museums that suddenly can propose a Warhol show without being dismissed. So.
Yes?
I wonder if anyone has written anything about the psychological value, the exercise, the brain exercise procedures has. Each one of those elicits a different set of nerves, brain synapses firing. So sometimes put together, it's an amazing brain exercise.
I don't know of anyone who's written about that, but now I will
Yeah.
look it up, certainly. Maybe one more question?
Since you work in an auction house, what, so are the Warhols in demand? Do they come in regularly? Do you seek them out? Clients, like say,
Yeah, I mean, on a commercial level, Warhol's probably one of the most international artists in the world. You know, you definitely have people from every culture that will recognize a Warhol, and I think because they recognize it, they want to buy it. Maybe perhaps second in line as far as American art would be Lichtenstein. But then someone like Jasper Johns, I think his vocabulary and iconography is too personal and you know, a little more something you need to know about to really appreciate some of the imagery. So that is, someone like Jasper Johns, even though he's considered of equal stature, is not international in that same sense that Warhol would be.
We can have one more question, or we can go see the exhibitions. I think we'll go see the exhibitions. Thank you.